The federal courthouse in downtown Philadelphia stood as a monument to justice, its limestone facade weathered by decades of northeastern winters. On the morning of October 15, 2025, the building buzzed with unusual energy. News vans lined Chestnut Street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, ready to broadcast what would become one of the most unprecedented moments in American legal history. Inside Courtroom 6A, the air conditioning hummed quietly, doing little to cool the tension that permeated every corner of the space. The mahogany benches were packed with journalists, lawyers, and curious citizens who had lined up since dawn to witness these proceedings. The American flag stood in its traditional position beside the state flag, both hanging motionless in the climate-controlled environment. Judge Alexander Brighton had presided over this courtroom for 18 years. At 52 years old, he was considered one of the most respected jurists in the Eastern District. His reputation for fairness and sharp legal mind had earned him accolades from both prosecution and defense attorneys. He had sentenced thousands during his tenure: white-collar criminals, organized crime figures, corrupt politicians. Never once had his integrity been questioned publicly until 3 months ago. The investigation had begun quietly, as these things often do. A junior prosecutor named David Chen had noticed irregularities in case assignments. Certain defendants, particularly those represented by the law firm of Sterling and Associates, seemed to receive unusually favorable rulings from Brighton's courtroom. The pattern was subtle enough to avoid immediate detection, but consistent enough to raise suspicion when examined closely. Chen had brought his concerns to the U.S. Attorney's Office in early June 2025. What started as a routine inquiry had mushroomed into a full-scale federal investigation involving the FBI, the Department of Justice, and the Judicial Conduct Board. Subpoenas were issued, financial records were scrutinized, bank accounts in the Cayman Islands were discovered, wire transfers totaling millions of dollars painted a damning picture. The evidence revealed a sophisticated corruption scheme spanning nearly a decade. Brighton had accepted bribes disguised as consulting fees, real estate investments, and offshore deposits. In exchange, he had manipulated case outcomes, reducing sentences, dismissing charges, suppressing evidence, and directing verdicts in civil cases. The corruption had touched approximately 700 cases, affecting countless lives. Now, on this crisp autumn morning, the tables had turned completely. Brighton no longer sat behind the bench, but at the defense table, his hands folded before him. He wore a charcoal suit that hung slightly loose on his frame. He had lost weight during the investigation. His silver hair, always impeccably styled, showed hints of disarray. The confidence that had once defined him had been replaced by something else, a profound weariness that seemed to emanate from his very core. Presiding over the proceedings was Judge Helen Torres, specially appointed by the Circuit Court. At 61, Torres had built her career on unwavering adherence to ethical standards. She was known for her no-nonsense approach and had volunteered to handle this sensitive case, understanding its implications for judicial integrity nationwide. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. The Honorable Judge Helen Torres presiding. Torres entered through the door behind the bench, her black robes flowing as she took her seat. She adjusted her reading glasses and surveyed the packed courtroom with a practiced eye. The weight of this moment was not lost on her. This was not just another sentencing, it was a referendum on the justice system itself. "Please be seated," she said, her voice firm but measured. "We are here today for the sentencing of Alexander James Brighton, who has pleaded guilty to multiple counts of bribery, honest services fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Counsel, are you ready to proceed?" The lead federal prosecutor, Angela Martinez, rose from her seat. She was 43, with a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on obsessive. She had spent the past 3 months building an airtight case, working 18-hour days to ensure every detail was documented and verified. Yes, Your Honor, the government is ready. Brighton's defense attorney, Leonard Hayes, stood next. Hayes was 70 years old, a veteran defense lawyer who had come out of semi-retirement to represent his former colleague. The two had known each other for 30 years, had shared countless lunches discussing legal theory and courtroom strategy. This case had aged Hayes visibly. "The defense is ready, Your Honor." Torres nodded. "Ms. Martinez, you may present the government's sentencing recommendation." Martinez approached the podium, carrying a thick file that represented months of investigation. She opened it deliberately, then looked up at Torres. "Your Honor, the government has thoroughly investigated the defendant's criminal conduct over a period spanning from January 2016 through June 2025. What we discovered was not isolated lapses in judgment, but a systematic corruption of the judicial process. The defendant used his position of trust and authority to enrich himself at the expense of justice itself." She paused, letting her words settle in the hushed courtroom. "The evidence shows that Alexander Brighton accepted bribes totaling approximately $8 million. These payments came from various sources: defense attorneys, corporate entities, individuals seeking favorable treatment in civil litigation. In exchange, the defendant manipulated case outcomes in at least 700 separate matters." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Torres struck her gavel once. "Order!" Martinez continued, her voice gaining intensity. "The victims of these crimes are numerous and diverse. There are individuals who were wrongly convicted or received excessive sentences because the defendant had been paid to ensure their guilt. There are crime victims who were denied justice because the defendant reduced sentences for those who had harmed them. There are civil litigants who lost legitimate claims because the defendant tilted the scales toward those who had purchased his favor." She turned slightly, gesturing toward the defense table where Brighton sat motionless. "The defendant has betrayed not only the oath he took as a judge, but the fundamental promise our legal system makes to every person, that they will be treated fairly and impartially under the law. His actions have undermined public confidence in the judiciary and made a mockery of the principles he swore to uphold." Martinez outlined specific cases, her voice steady as she detailed the human cost of Brighton's corruption. She spoke of a small business owner who had lost everything when Brighton ruled against him in a contract dispute. The opposing party had paid $200,000 for that outcome. She described an elderly woman who had been defrauded of her life savings, only to see the perpetrator receive probation instead of prison time, because Brighton had been compensated handsomely. The federal sentencing guidelines recommend a range based on the total dollar amount involved and the number of victims affected. However, Your Honor, the government believes this case demands a more severe response. When a judge corrupts the justice system from within, the damage extends far beyond any single victim or any single case. It strikes at the very foundation of our democratic society. She paused, taking a breath before delivering the government's recommendation. "The government requests that this court sentence Alexander Brighton to the maximum term possible under law for each count of conviction to be served consecutively. We ask that this court send an unequivocal message that judicial corruption will not be tolerated, cannot be mitigated, and must be punished with the full force of the law." Martinez gathered her papers and returned to her seat. The courtroom remained silent, the gravity of her words hanging in the air like a physical presence. Torres made notes on her legal pad, then looked toward the defense table. "Mr. Hayes, does the defense wish to present a sentencing argument?" Hayes stood slowly, the effort visible in his movements. He walked to the podium without notes, his hands gripping the edges for support. Your Honor, I stand before you today in perhaps the most difficult moment of my career. I have known Alexander Brighton for 3 decades. I have watched him handle thousands of cases with what I believed was integrity and fairness. The revelations of recent months have shaken me to my core, as they have shaken everyone in the legal community. He glanced back at Brighton, who sat with his eyes downcast. I cannot and will not defend the actions he has taken. They are indefensible. He betrayed his oath, betrayed the public trust, and betrayed those of us who considered him a friend and colleague. The harm he has caused is immeasurable, and no words I speak today can diminish that reality. Hayes paused, collecting himself. But I stand here as his lawyer, and I must fulfill my duty to present factors the court should consider in determining an appropriate sentence. Alexander Brighton has accepted full responsibility for his actions. He has pleaded guilty to all charges without seeking a plea agreement or any consideration from the government. He has cooperated fully with investigators, providing information and documents that have been valuable in understanding the full scope of his misconduct. Torres listened intently, her expression neutral. The defendant has expressed genuine remorse, not merely for being caught, but for the damage he has inflicted. He understands that his career is over, his reputation destroyed, his legacy tainted forever. He faces financial ruin, as all assets connected to his criminal conduct have been seized. He has lost the respect of his peers, the trust of his family, and any hope of redemption in the eyes of the public. Hayes's voice grew softer, more personal. Your Honor, I ask not for leniency in the traditional sense. I ask only that this court impose a sentence that is just, one that punishes appropriately but does not lose sight of the human being before you. Alexander Brighton is not defined solely by his worst actions, though those actions are terrible and deserving of severe punishment. He is also a person who, for reasons he may never fully understand himself, lost his way and destroyed everything he had worked to build. He concluded his argument and returned to his seat. Brighton placed a hand briefly on Hayes's shoulder, a small gesture of gratitude. Torres reviewed her notes for several moments. The courtroom remained absolutely still, hundreds of people barely breathing as they waited for what would come next. Mr. Brighton, Torres said finally, do you wish to make a statement before sentencing? Brighton rose slowly. His movements were deliberate, measured, as though he was physically bearing the weight of his crimes. He walked to the podium without assistance, standing alone before the judge who would determine his fate. Yes, Your Honor, I do. His voice was steady, but carried an undertone of deep emotion. He did not use notes, speaking instead from memory and from the heart. I stand before this court as a criminal, not as a judge, not as a colleague, but as someone who has violated the most fundamental principles of justice and honor. I offer no excuses for my conduct. I do not ask for sympathy or mercy. I stand here to accept responsibility and to acknowledge the terrible harm I have caused. Brighton's hands gripped the podium, his knuckles white with tension. He had practiced this statement countless times in his cell, yet now, under the weight of hundreds of watching eyes, the words felt inadequate to capture the magnitude of his betrayal. For 18 years, I sat where Judge Torres now sits. I listened to defendants explain their crimes, offer justifications, express remorse. I imposed sentences designed to punish, to deter, to protect society. I believed myself to be on the side of justice, a guardian of the law. The truth is far more shameful. He paused, his voice threatening to break. He steadied himself, determined to complete what might be his final public statement. I cannot pinpoint the exact moment when I crossed the line. Perhaps it was gradual, a small favor here, a minor consideration there. Or perhaps I deceived myself from the beginning, rationalizing each corrupt act as somehow acceptable. Whatever the genesis of my crimes, the result is clear. I destroyed lives, corrupted justice, and betrayed every person who appeared in my courtroom seeking fairness. Brighton's eyes moved across the gallery, where he could see faces of people affected by his actions. Some had been defendants in cases he had manipulated. Others were victims of crimes whose perpetrators had received favorable treatment because of bribes. Still others were lawyers, judges, and court staff who had trusted him, and now felt that trust had been weaponized against the very system they served. I think often of the people whose cases I mishandled. A man who served additional years in prison because I had been paid to deny his legitimate appeal. A woman who lost custody of her children because the opposing party had purchased my favor. Business owners who were bankrupted by fraudulent litigation that I allowed to proceed despite clear evidence of wrongdoing. Crime victims who watched as I gave minimal sentences to those who had harmed them. His voice grew stronger, powered now by a need to articulate the full scope of his understanding. Each of these people came to court believing the system would work. They believed that facts would matter, that law would be applied fairly, that justice was more than an abstract concept. I took that belief and corrupted it for personal gain. I transformed the courtroom from a place of justice into a marketplace where outcomes could be purchased by the highest bidder. Torres remained impassive, but she was listening carefully to every word. This was not the typical allocution of a defendant seeking to minimize consequences. This was something different, a confession in the truest sense, an unburdening of guilt that seemed almost cathartic. I betrayed my colleagues in the judiciary who performed their duties with honor and integrity. I gave ammunition to those who cynically claim that all judges are corrupt, that the system is rigged, that justice is an illusion. I know that my actions will make their jobs harder, will subject them to increased scrutiny and suspicion, will undermine public confidence in the courts. For this, I am profoundly sorry. Brighton turned slightly, looking directly at Judge Torres. Your Honor, I understand that you will impose a severe sentence. I deserve nothing less, but I want to say something that may surprise people in this courtroom. I believe I should receive the maximum possible punishment under law for each count of my conviction, and I believe those sentences should run consecutively, not concurrently. A ripple of surprise moved through the gallery. Even Hayes, Brighton's own attorney, looked startled. This was not something they had discussed. Brighton continued, his voice unwavering. I have calculated that such a sentence would total approximately 700 years of imprisonment, roughly 1 year for each case I corrupted. While I obviously cannot serve such a sentence in its entirety, the symbolic meaning is important. Each year represents a case, a life affected, a betrayal of trust. Each year represents a debt to justice that I can never fully repay. Torres leaned forward slightly, her interest clearly piqued by this unprecedented statement. I ask this court to impose that sentence not because I want to be seen as somehow noble or redemptive. I am neither. I ask for this sentence because it represents truth, the truth of what I did, the scope of the damage I caused, the magnitude of my betrayal. A lesser sentence, while perhaps more practical, would minimize the reality of my crimes. Martinez at the prosecution table was frantically taking notes. This was completely outside the normal parameters of sentencing proceedings. Defendants did not typically argue for harsher punishment than even the government requested. I spent 18 years sentencing others. I lectured defendants about responsibility, about the consequences of their choices, about the need for punishment to reflect the severity of crimes. Now I find myself on the other side of that equation, and I understand with painful clarity what those words truly mean. Responsibility means acknowledging Not just that you did something wrong, but accepting the full weight of consequences without excuse or mitigation. He took a breath, gathering himself for his conclusion. Your Honor, if this court imposes a sentence of 700 years, I will not appeal. I will not seek reduction or modification. I will accept it as the just outcome of my criminal conduct, and perhaps in some small way that acceptance will send a message that judicial integrity matters, that corruption will not be tolerated, and that even those who hold positions of power are subject to the same laws they are sworn to uphold. Brighton stepped back from the podium, his statement complete. He returned to his seat beside Hayes, who looked at him with a mixture of concern and confusion. They had prepared for many possible scenarios, but this had not been among them. Torres removed her glasses, setting them carefully on the bench before her. She had presided over hundreds of sentencings during her career, but never had she heard a defendant argue so forcefully for his own maximum punishment. The moment demanded careful consideration. Mr. Brighton, I want to ensure I understand correctly. You are requesting that this court impose consecutive maximum sentences totaling approximately 700 years of imprisonment. Yes, Your Honor, that is my request. And you understand that such a sentence is essentially a life term, that you would die in federal custody regardless of any possibility of early release or good conduct credits. I understand completely, Your Honor. Torres turned to the prosecutors. Ms. Martinez, what is the government's position on the defendant's request? Martinez stood, still processing this unusual turn of events. Your Honor, the government has consistently sought the maximum possible sentence in this case. If the defendant wishes to join in that recommendation, we have no objection. However, we want to ensure that this is a knowing and voluntary request, not the result of some misguided sense of martyrdom. Mr. Hayes, Torres addressed the defense attorney. Did you advise your client to make this request? Hayes stood, clearly uncomfortable. No, Your Honor. This is the first I'm hearing of it in these specific terms. We discussed various sentencing scenarios, but Mr. Brighton never expressed this particular position to me. I would ask for a brief recess to consult with my client and ensure he understands the implications of what he is requesting. Torres nodded. That is appropriate. We will take a 15-minute recess. Mr. Brighton, please consult with your attorney. When we return, I want to be certain that you are making this request with full understanding of its consequences. The bailiff announced the recess, and Torres exited through the door behind the bench. The courtroom erupted in conversation as journalists rushed to file updates and spectators discussed what they had just witnessed. In a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom, Hayes closed the door firmly and turned to face his client. His expression was a mixture of frustration and concern. "What are you doing?" he asked bluntly. "We never discussed this strategy. You're essentially asking the judge to impose a death sentence." Brighton sat down heavily in one of the chairs. "I know exactly what I'm doing. For the first time in years, I'm doing something honest." "This isn't about honesty or redemption," Hayes argued. "This is about ensuring that the sentence is appropriate and legally sound. A sentence of 700 years serves no penological purpose beyond symbolism." "Symbolism matters," Brighton replied quietly. "The legal system is built on symbols, the scales of justice, the blindfold, the gavel. Those symbols represent ideals. I corrupted those ideals, turned them into tools for personal enrichment. The sentence should reflect that betrayal." Hayes sat across from him, his voice softening. "I've represented hundreds of clients over my career. I've never had one argue against his own interests like this. You have a daughter, grandchildren. Don't you want whatever time you have left?" Brighton's composure cracked slightly. His daughter had stopped visiting him after the indictment. His grandchildren, who he had taken to baseball games and taught to fish, no longer knew him. The personal cost of his crimes had been devastating. "What I want is irrelevant," he said finally. "What matters is sending the right message. If I receive a relatively modest sentence, it tells other judges that corruption can be managed, that the consequences aren't really that severe. But if the sentence reflects the true scope of the damage, 700 cases, 700 breaches of trust, then maybe it deters the next person tempted to abuse their position." Hayes studied his client carefully. "You're certain about this?" "Completely certain." When court reconvened, Torres resumed her position on the bench. The crowd settled quickly, eager to hear what would happen next. "Mr. Hayes, have you consulted with your client?" "Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Brighton wishes to maintain his request for consecutive maximum sentences." Torres turned her attention to Brighton. "Mr. Brighton, I need to hear from you directly. After consulting with your attorney and understanding the implications, do you still request that this court impose consecutive maximum sentences totaling approximately 700 years? Brighton stood. "Yes, Your Honor. I make that request knowingly and voluntarily." Torres paused, considering her response carefully. "Mr. Brighton, while I appreciate your willingness to accept responsibility, this court has an independent obligation to impose a sentence that is sufficient but not greater than necessary to achieve the purposes of sentencing. Those purposes include punishment, deterrence, protection of the public, and rehabilitation." She opened a leather-bound volume containing sentencing guidelines and case law. "The government has recommended maximum consecutive sentences. You have joined in that recommendation. The question before me is whether such a sentence is legally appropriate and serves the interests of justice." Torres spent the next 20 minutes reviewing the legal framework for sentencing, citing precedents, and explaining the factors she was required to consider. She discussed the nature and circumstances of Brighton's offences, his history and characteristics, the need for deterrence, and the impact on victims. "The evidence shows that you abused your position systematically over nearly a decade. You accepted millions of dollars in bribes. You manipulated approximately 700 cases, affecting hundreds of lives. The harm you caused to individual victims is substantial. The harm you caused to public confidence in the judiciary is immeasurable." She paused, looking directly at Brighton. "You have expressed what appears to be genuine remorse. You have cooperated with investigators. You have accepted responsibility without seeking any benefit in return. These factors typically warrant some consideration in sentencing. However, the severity of your crimes and the unique nature of judicial corruption require an extraordinary response." Torres closed the volume before her and folded her hands. "Mr. Brighton, I have considered your request for consecutive maximum sentences. I have reviewed the recommendations of both parties. I've examined the relevant law and considered the purposes of sentencing. I find that your crimes warrant the most severe punishment available under law." The courtroom was absolutely silent. On count 1, bribery affecting public officials, the court sentences you to 20 years imprisonment. On count 2, honest services fraud, 20 years imprisonment to run consecutively. On count 3, obstruction of justice, 10 years imprisonment to run consecutively. Torres continued through each count, imposing maximum terms and ordering them to run consecutively rather than concurrently. The arithmetic was stark and unyielding. By the time she finished, the total exceeded 700 years. The aggregate sentence is 720 years imprisonment in a federal correctional facility. You will receive credit for time served since your arrest. You are ordered to pay restitution to victims in the amount of $8 million. plus additional amounts to be determined through a separate proceeding. You will have no eligibility for parole, though you may earn good conduct credits under federal law. Brighton stood motionless, absorbing the sentence. 720 years, longer than the United States had existed as a nation, longer than several lifetimes. A sentence that was both literal and symbolic, practical and metaphorical. "Mr. Brighton," Torres continued, her voice taking on a different tone, "this sentence reflects the extraordinary nature of your crimes. When a judge corrupts the system from within, the damage radiates outward in ways that are difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. You took an oath to administer justice without bias or favor. You broke that oath repeatedly and deliberately. This sentence represents society's judgment on that betrayal." She paused, and something unexpected happened. Her expression softened slightly, revealing a hint of the personal impact this case had on her. "I want to say something that is not typically part of a sentencing colloquy. I have been a judge for 23 years. I love the law. I believe deeply in the justice system, despite its imperfections. Your crimes have hurt me personally, as they have hurt every judge who takes their responsibilities seriously. You have made our jobs harder. You have given credence to cynics who claim the system is fundamentally corrupt. You have betrayed not just your oath, but our collective commitment to justice." Torres picked up her gavel, then set it down again without using it. "However, I must also acknowledge something remarkable about these proceedings. You have done something I have never seen in my career. You have asked to be punished to the fullest extent of the law. You have not minimized your conduct or sought sympathy. You have accepted responsibility in its truest form. Whether this reflects genuine remorse or simply recognition of your hopeless position, I cannot know with certainty. But your willingness to face the full consequences of your actions is noteworthy." She finally lifted the gavel. "The sentence is imposed. Mr. Brighton, you are remanded to the custody of the United States Marshal Service for transportation to a federal facility designated by the Bureau of Prisons. This court is adjourned." The gavel fell with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom. The sound seemed to mark not just the end of proceedings, but the end of an era. The conclusion of Brighton's life as a free man and the symbolic closing of a dark chapter in judicial history. Marshals moved forward to take Brighton into custody. Hayes stood beside his client one final time, placing a hand on his shoulder. They exchanged no words. None were needed. Brighton turned, allowed the marshals to place him in handcuffs, and was led from the courtroom through a side door. As the crowd filed out, conversations erupted about what they had witnessed. Legal scholars would debate for years whether the sentence was appropriate, whether it served any purpose beyond symbolism, whether Brighton's request for maximum punishment was genuine contrition or calculated theatre. But in that moment, as the courtroom emptied and the afternoon light slanted through the high windows, there was a sense that something important had occurred, a reckoning, a moment of accountability, a reassertion of principles that had been violated. 6 weeks after his sentencing, Alexander Brighton sat in a visitation room at the Federal Correctional Facility in Pennsylvania, where he had been housed pending designation to a permanent institution. The room was institutional. Cinder block walls painted a pale green, metal tables bolted to the floor, plastic chairs that offered no comfort. A guard stood by the door, present but attempting to be unobtrusive. Across from Brighton sat his daughter, Emily. She was 34 years old, a high school teacher with 2 children of her own. She had not visited since before the trial, had not spoken to him since the investigation became public. Her presence now was unexpected. "I didn't think you'd come," Brighton said quietly. Emily looked at him, her expression complex. anger mixed with pain, mixed with something else that might have been the beginning of understanding. "I almost didn't," she admitted. "I watched the sentencing on television. I heard what you said, what you asked the judge to do. I didn't understand it at first. I was angry that you were being dramatic, making yourself into some kind of martyr." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But then I talked to my therapist about it. About you, about what you did, about how to explain it to my kids when they get older and ask about their grandfather. And I started to think about responsibility, what it really means to take responsibility for your actions." Brighton remained silent, letting her speak. "You destroyed lives, Dad. You corrupted something that people needed to believe in, and you did it for money, for status, for things that don't matter. I'm still angry about that. I don't know if I'll ever stop being angry about it." "You shouldn't stop being angry," Brighton replied. "The anger is justified." "But," Emily continued, "I think I understand why you asked for that sentence. It wasn't about redemption or forgiveness. It was about truth, about acknowledging the full weight of what you did without trying to minimize it or explain it away." She reached across the table, not quite touching his hand, but close enough that the gesture's meaning was clear. "I can't forgive you. Not yet, maybe not ever. But I wanted you to know that I see what you're trying to do. You're trying to be honest, maybe for the first time in years. That doesn't erase the harm you caused, but it's something." They talked for another 30 minutes about small things, her children, her job, the changing seasons. When visiting time ended, Emily stood to leave. At the door, she turned back. "The kids ask about you sometimes. I don't know what to tell them." "Tell them the truth," Brighton said. "Tell them their grandfather was a judge who did terrible things, who betrayed people's trust, who is now paying the price for those choices. And tell them that actions have consequences, that responsibility matters, that integrity is more valuable than any amount of money or success." Emily nodded slowly, then left without looking back. Brighton returned to his cell, a 6-by-8-foot space that would be his home for the remainder of his life. He had a thin mattress, a small metal desk, a toilet and sink. His possessions consisted of a few books, some writing materials, and photographs of his family from better times. He sat on the edge of the bed, thinking about the path that had brought him here. The investigation had revealed that his first corrupt act occurred in early 2016, a relatively small bribe of $50,000 to rule favorably in a civil contract dispute. The money had been paid through a complex series of transactions designed to obscure its origin. Brighton had convinced himself it was a one-time lapse, that he would return to proper conduct immediately afterward. But corruption, like rust, spreads once it gains a foothold. The second bribe was easier to justify than the first, the third easier still. Within a year, he had developed a sophisticated system for accepting payments and delivering favorable rulings. The money had allowed him to live a lifestyle beyond his judicial salary, a vacation home, expensive cars, private school tuition for his grandchildren. Now, all of that was gone. The houses had been seized. The bank accounts frozen and then forfeited. His pension was suspended pending administrative proceedings. His family had been left with almost nothing, forced to rely on Emily's teacher salary and her husband's income from managing a small restaurant. Brighton pulled out a sheet of paper and began to write. He had started composing letters to victims of his corruption, not seeking forgiveness, but attempting to articulate his understanding of the harm he had caused. He knew most would never read these letters, that many would throw them away unopened, but he wrote them anyway, working through a list of names that seemed to have no end. Outside his cell window, he could see a small section of sky. It was late October, and the leaves on distant trees were brilliant with autumn color. The world continued its cycle of seasons, indifferent to the small dramas of human corruption and consequence unfolding within prison walls. In Philadelphia, the federal courthouse had returned to its normal rhythm. New cases were assigned, trials proceeded, justice was administered in the imperfect way that human institutions always function. Judge Torres had resumed her regular docket, though she found herself thinking often about the Brighton case and what it represented. The legal community continued to process the implications of a judge sentencing himself to 700 years. Law review articles were written. Ethics seminars incorporated the case into their curriculum. Some argued that the sentence was excessive, a symbolic gesture that served no practical purpose. Others maintained it was exactly right, a recognition that judicial corruption demanded extraordinary punishment. In Congress, legislation was proposed to strengthen oversight of federal judges and create additional safeguards against corruption. Some of these measures would eventually become law, a direct result of the Brighton scandal and the national conversation it had sparked. For the victims of Brighton's crimes, the sentence brought mixed emotions. Some felt validated, believing that justice had finally been served. Others found no comfort in it, recognizing that no punishment could undo the harm they had suffered. A few expressed surprise that Brighton had essentially sentenced himself, wondering if it represented genuine remorse or merely a calculated attempt to shape his legacy. As November arrived and then December, Brighton settled into the routine of prison life. He worked in the law library, helping other inmates with their appeals and legal filings. The irony of a corrupt judge now assisting prisoners with their cases was not lost on him, but he found purpose in the work. He was careful never to provide advice that might be unethical or that might give false hope to those he helped. He attended classes offered to inmates, substance counseling, anger management, financial literacy. He exercised in the yard when weather permitted. He read voraciously, everything from philosophy to history to novels. He continued writing his letters to victims, knowing that each one was inadequate, but feeling compelled to try anyway. On December 31st, 2025, Brighton stood at his cell window, watching the sunset over the Pennsylvania landscape. Somewhere in the distance, people were preparing to celebrate the new year, to make resolutions and express hope for better days ahead. For Brighton, the calendar's turn held no such promise. Every new year would be identical to the last. The same cell, the same routine, the same reality of 700 years, stretching ahead like an infinite horizon. But he had made a choice, to accept full responsibility, to face consequences without excuse or mitigation, to acknowledge truth even when truth offered no comfort. Whether that choice meant anything in the larger scheme of justice and redemption, he could not know. What he did know was that it was the only honest path available to him. As darkness fell and the year drew to its close, Alexander Brighton reflected on the words he had spoken at his sentencing. He had asked for 700 years, one for each case he had corrupted, each breach of trust, each betrayal of the oath he had taken. The sentence had been imposed, and now he would serve it to the best of his ability for whatever time remained to him. Outside, fireworks began to bloom in the distant sky, brief flowers of light celebrating the passage of time and the eternal human hope for renewal. Inside his cell, Brighton turned from the window and prepared for another day identical to all the others that would follow. A day of paying the price for choices made, consequences accepted, and a reckoning that would extend far beyond his lifetime. The story of the judge who sentenced himself to 700 years would become part of legal law, cited in courtrooms and classrooms, debated by scholars and practitioners. But for Brighton himself, it was simply reality, the truth of what he had done, the weight of what he owed, and the recognition that some debts can never be fully repaid, only honestly acknowledged. And so the days passed, one after another, 700 years of judgment stretching into the future, a sentence that was both impossibly long and entirely deserved, a final verdict on a career that had promised justice but delivered only corruption, and a life that would end not in redemption but in the honest acceptance of consequences earned.